The very first Sherlock Holmes story, A Study in Scarlet.
It was late afternoon when we returned to Baker Street. Holmes had been in one of his brisk, lively moods ever since leaving the crime scene. He moved quickly about our sitting room, jotting notes, pulling books from the shelf, and muttering observations under his breath. His energy always amazed me. Most men would collapse into a chair after a long day in the field, but Holmes seemed only more alive once a puzzle was in his hands. "I've set the trap, Watson," he said, finally tossing his notebook aside. "Now we wait for the quarry to walk into it." Before I could ask what exactly he meant, Mrs. Hudson came to the door and announced, "Two gentlemen to see you, Mr. Holmes." Moments later, Inspector Gregson and Inspector Lestrade entered. The two detectives could not have been more different. Gregson was tall, fair, and rather precise in his manners. Lestrade, shorter and darker, carried an air of sharpness and constant suspicion. Holmes greeted them both with a polite but faintly amused smile, gesturing to the chairs by the fireplace. "I understand you've both been working hard on the Lauriston Gardens affair," Holmes said smoothly. "Please, gentlemen, enlighten us." Gregson, always eager to be first, cleared his throat and launched into his explanation. "It's all quite straightforward, really. The murdered man was Enoch Drebber, an American from Cleveland. He had been staying at Holiday's private hotel. He was last seen leaving the hotel with his secretary, Joseph Stangenson. There had been some quarrel between them. Stangenson did not return to the hotel. Now, Drebber's body is found in an empty house with no signs of robbery. Who else could it be but Stangenson?" Gregson leaned back, pleased with himself. Holmes steepled his fingers and regarded him quietly. "And your evidence?" "Well," Gregson said, a little flustered at the calm question, "Drebber's landlady heard him quarrelling with Stangenson on the night before. Several cabmen also saw the two together. Stangenson has disappeared since the murder. Circumstantial, perhaps, but strong enough, I'd say." I could see Holmes's eyes glint with suppressed amusement, but before he commented, Lestrade, unwilling to be outdone, leaned forward. "My turn now, Mr. Holmes. You see, Gregson is all wrong. The secretary had nothing to do with it. This was clearly a woman's doing." Gregson gave a snort of disbelief, but Lestrade pressed on. "You recall the wedding ring found at the scene? That is the key. Drebber was a coarse man, fond of drink and women. He must have wronged some woman, and she followed him to London. She confronted him in that house. There was a struggle, and she killed him in a fit of rage. The writing on the wall, the word Reich, that's just a blind, meant to mislead us. It's German for revenge, yes, but in my view, it was only meant to throw us off." Lestrade looked smug, folding his arms. For a few moments, Holmes remained silent, gazing into the fire with a faint smile playing at his lips. I knew this expression well. It was the look he wore whenever someone had walked directly into one of his intellectual traps. At last, Holmes turned toward the inspectors. "Gentlemen," he said in his most courteous tone, "it is refreshing to hear such different theories on the same facts. And yet both of you are wrong." Gregson sat bolt upright. Lestrade frowned deeply. Holmes rose to his feet, pacing slowly as he spoke, his voice low but brimming with confidence. "Consider first the fact that the word Reich was written on the wall in blood, yet no wound was found on the body. Where did the blood come from? Second, the absence of footprints leading to the house. The ground was damp, yet there was none. Third, the manner of death. There was no wound, no sign of struggle, and yet Drebber's face was contorted in the extremity of fear. Poison, gentlemen, a very particular poison, one that works swiftly and leaves no trace except terror on its victim's face." Gregson looked utterly bewildered. Lestrade scoffed, but his expression betrayed doubt. Holmes continued, his hands clasped behind his back. "And as for the ring, yes, it belonged to a woman, but not the murderer. It is a clue, certainly, but not in the sense you imagine, Lestrade." At that moment, a knock came at the door. Mrs. Hudson reappeared, this time carrying a small card on a tray. Holmes took the card, glanced at it, and smiled faintly. "Ah, the case grows more interesting. A visitor has come who may shed light upon the matter." Holmes handed me the card, and I read the name printed upon it. Mrs. Sawyer, 3 Pinchin Lane. Beneath it was scrawled in a hurried hand, "Found a ring. Wants to see you." Holmes gave a satisfied nod, as though this were precisely what he had been expecting. He turned to the 2 inspectors, who were still sitting in their chairs, watching all this unfold with mixed irritation and curiosity. "Gentlemen," he said, "this may prove instructive. Please, remain if you wish and see how we catch the scent of truth." Mrs. Hudson showed in a woman who appeared to be a poorly dressed, middle-aged charwoman. She was stooped, her hands rough with work, and she twisted a worn shawl nervously around her shoulders. "Please, ma'am, sit down," Holmes said kindly. "You have something to show me." The woman curtsied awkwardly and fished in her apron pocket, drawing out the very same gold wedding ring that Lestrade had spoken of with such certainty earlier. "Yes, sir," she said in a cracked voice. "I was sweeping up yesterday at my place when I found this ring in the ash bin. I thought maybe it was valuable, so I asked around, and someone said I'd best take it to Mr. Sherlock Holmes." Holmes took the ring, examined it carefully with his glass, and then set it upon the mantel. "And how long had it been in your possession before you decided to come here?" "Oh, just since yesterday, sir. I thought maybe I could get a reward for it. I'm a poor woman, sir, and it's hard to get by." Holmes studied her a moment. "I see. And you live at 3 Pinchin Lane?" "Yes, sir, that's right." Holmes smiled faintly, and then his voice hardened just a fraction. "Well, I shall tell you what to do. You must return home at once. A man may come to ask after this ring. If he does, keep him talking until I arrive. Do you understand?" The woman blinked in confusion, her gnarled hands twisting her shawl. Oh, yes, sir. I suppose so." Holmes pressed half a sovereign into her palm and showed her to the door with uncommon politeness. She thanked him profusely and shuffled out. The moment she was gone, Holmes' entire demeanor shifted. His eyes sparked with energy, and he gave a quick, almost boyish laugh. "The trap is sprung, Watson. The bird has fluttered into the net." Gregson looked utterly lost. "What do you mean, Mr. Holmes? That was just an old woman." Holmes threw himself into a chair, chuckling. "An old woman? No, no. That was a man in disguise, and a clever one, too. The beard, the stoop, the cracked voice, the hands, all carefully arranged. But his boots, gentlemen, betrayed him. Those were not a charwoman's boots, a cabman's, I'd wager. And did you note the nails in the soles? Freshly mended, but too large for a woman's foot." Lestrade slapped his knee. "By heaven, I didn't catch it. So the murderer himself." "Exactly," Holmes said coolly. "He came to see if the ring had been found. He must have dropped it at the scene and feared it would lead him to him. He disguised himself and came here to recover it. Unfortunately for him, he has revealed far more than he intended." I sat in astonishment, still picturing the bent figure that had just left. In all my years of practice, I had never seen such an extraordinary reversal of appearances. Holmes leaned forward, his eyes bright. "Now we know he is desperate. We know his disguise, and we know he is still in London. The next step is to identify the cabman who brought him here. The case is tightening, gentlemen, and soon the noose will be drawn." Gregson and Lestrade exchanged a look. For once, they seemed united in their amazement, even if neither wanted to admit it aloud. Holmes rose, striking a match to light his pipe. The smoke curled lazily around him as he turned back toward the fire. "Mark my words, before long we shall have him." And with that, he settled into his chair, perfectly at ease, as if the man who had just slipped from our grasp was not a cunning murderer, but a simple problem already solved in his mind.
By the next day, Holmes was more restless than usual. He had spent the evening in one of his manic states, darting about the room, writing letters, sending notes off with messengers, and then lapsing into long silences as he smoked and stared into the fire. I, accustomed by now to his strange rhythms, simply kept to my chair and observed, wondering at what point all the threads he gathered would knot themselves into a finished picture. It was just after breakfast when Mrs. Hudson came up with a message. "A gentleman wishes to see you, Mr. Holmes." And in stepped Inspector Gregson, looking as proud as a schoolboy with a prize ribbon. His blonde hair was a little ruffled, his eyes gleamed with triumph, and he carried himself with the importance of a man who believed he was about to astonish us all. "Well, Mr. Holmes," Gregson said, dropping heavily into a chair, "I fancy I've made it all right at last." Holmes gave him a faint smile. "Really? Then pray, enlighten us." Gregson drew himself up, clearly enjoying the moment. "You remember I told you about Joseph Stangerson, the secretary to the deceased Drebber? Well, sir, we've got him under lock and key." I leaned forward, startled. "You've arrested him?" Gregson nodded, beaming. "Yes, indeed. All London will ring with it by tonight. The case is as good as finished." Holmes stretched out lazily on the sofa, his expression unreadable. "And what evidence do you have against him?" Gregson chuckled as though this were the easiest question in the world. "Plenty. First off, there was the quarrel between him and his master, as you already know. Second, Drebber was last seen alive in his company. Third, Stangerson's disappearance since the murder is suspicious enough. And lastly, here's the crowning proof, a telegram that came from Cleveland addressed to Drebber only yesterday. It was delivered to Holiday's Hotel, but by then Drebber was already dead. Guess who called for it? Joseph Stangerson. He slapped his knee as though no jury in the world could doubt such proof. Holmes merely raised his eyebrows. "And where did you apprehend him?" "At Holiday's Hotel. He had taken up lodgings there, it seems, and was trying to pass himself off as quiet as you please. But he couldn't keep it up. We nabbed him last night, and he's cooling his heels at Bow Street Station right now." Holmes blew a lazy smoke ring and said nothing. Gregson frowned. "You don't seem very impressed, Mr. Holmes." "I am always impressed by energy and initiative," Holmes replied calmly. "But tell me, have you examined his person carefully? Did you find the woman's wedding ring in his possession?" Gregson blinked. "Well, no, but that may have been lost elsewhere." "Did you find any traces of blood on his clothes?" "No, sir, his clothes were quite clean." "Or poison? Any chemicals?" Gregson shook his head, his confidence beginning to falter under Holmes's steady questioning. "Then forgive me if I do not share in your triumph. The man you have in custody is not our murderer." Gregson's face flushed. He opened his mouth to retort, but at that very moment there came a sharp knock at the door. Lestrade entered, his face pale and his usual smugness replaced by a grim seriousness. "Holmes," he said quickly, "I came straight to you. There's been another murder." That word hung in the air like a thunderclap. Even Gregson's mouth fell open. "Another?" I exclaimed. "Yes," Lestrade said. "Joseph Stangerson has been found dead in his lodgings." Gregson sprang to his feet. "What? Dead?" Lestrade repeated. "Stabbed to the heart, lying in bed, and the word Ratch written on the wall above him." Holmes sat up suddenly, his eyes shining with excitement rather than horror. "At last," he murmured. "At last, The case begins to unfold. I had not expected, when Holmes summoned me from my writing, that the evening would extend into such a remarkable procession of events. His excitement, once kindled, seemed inexhaustible, and as we pressed further into the grim business of our investigation, I could not help but admire the sheer unflagging energy with which he pursued the matter. The small knot of constables trailed after us, their boots clattering upon the cobbled street, their lanterns swaying like restless stars in the fog. I was close at Holmes's shoulder, my curiosity tugging me forward, though a certain dread weighed in my breast. Lestrade walked a step or two to the side, his sharp bird-like face drawn into lines of perpetual suspicion. Gregson, larger and more confident in manner, strode with an air of authority he was far from actually commanding, for it was plain, even to me, that Holmes was the pivot upon which the whole affair turned. "Observe, Watson," Holmes murmured as we advanced, "the curious matter of the footprints, their angles and positions. It is here, in these details, that the very soul of the deed is betrayed." He paused to examine the faint tracks left in the damp ground, stooping so low that the lamplight cast long shadows of his lean frame against the nearest wall. The policemen clustered, muttering their small observations, but Holmes waved them silent with an impatient flick of his hand. He remained utterly absorbed in the marks upon the earth, tracing them with a gloved finger, as if reading some secret alphabet. I could not help but marvel at the transformation in him. At Baker Street he had seemed almost languid, careless even, as though life contained for him no sufficient stimulus. Yet now, engaged upon his chosen field, he was all fire and vigor, keen, alert, a living embodiment of restless intellect. His eyes shone with that strange inward light I had come to recognize as the outward sign of his most intense moments of reasoning. At length, with a satisfied exclamation, he straightened. "The net tightens, gentlemen," said he, brushing the damp from his hands. "The quarry is more desperate than you think, yet he cannot elude us for long. Every move he makes only serves to reveal him further." Lestrade pursed his lips. "You speak with confidence, Mr. Holmes, and yet allow me to remind you we have a dead man upon our hands, no sign of forced entry, and not a scrap of evidence as to the murderer's identity." Holmes regarded him coolly. "On the contrary, Inspector, we possess more evidence than one might gather in a dozen ordinary cases. The very difficulty you perceive is but the mask of clarity to one who reads the signs aright." The air of mystery thickened around us, as though the very fog conspired to heighten our suspense. We continued in silence for a time, until Holmes led us to a halt before a lonely stretch of road where the tracks he had followed seemed to converge and then vanish. Here he stood for several long minutes, his head inclined, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. I confess my patience wore thin. My medical training had not prepared me for such still vigils in the chill night, and I found myself stamping my feet to keep the blood moving, yet I dared not interrupt him. His concentration was profound, and to break it would have been sacrilege. At last he turned, his face lit with triumph. "Gentlemen, the stage is set. Tomorrow I shall produce the man who struck down poor Drebber, and with him the whole tangled skein will unravel." A murmur of incredulity passed among the inspectors. Gregson gave a short laugh of disbelief, while Lestrade narrowed his eyes, half amused and half annoyed. "And how do you propose to perform that miracle?" Gregson demanded. Holmes's lips curled in a thin smile. "By the simplest of devices. I shall require but a little assistance from you, Inspector, and a willingness to follow instructions without question.
Do so, and the murderer shall be delivered into our hands as surely as if he walked to us of his own accord." There was a moment's silence. Then Lestrade, always eager to stake his claim, nodded stiffly. "Very well, Mr. Holmes, let us see what comes of it. But I warn you, I'll not be made a fool before my superiors." "You need fear nothing but your own doubt," Holmes replied calmly. With that, the company dispersed, each to his duty, though Holmes and I lingered a little longer. As we retraced our steps towards Baker Street, I could restrain my curiosity no longer. "For heaven's sake, Holmes," I said, "you speak as if the case were already in your grasp, yet I confess I see nothing but darkness. How can you be so certain?" He looked at me with that peculiar expression of mingled amusement and affection which I had begun to recognize in him. "My dear Watson, it is all so absurdly plain. You see the details, but you do not connect them. Tomorrow I shall show you how trifles become decisive facts, and you will realize how elementary the matter is." I could only shake my head, half vexed, half admiring. To him all was light, where to me it was impenetrable shadow. Yet even in my bewilderment I felt the thrill of standing beside a man whose genius could pierce the darkest mysteries, and so, with anticipation mingled with unease, we returned to our rooms, while the city around us lay cloaked in fog and secrecy, unaware that the hand of justice was already closing upon the murderer.